I have to tell this story slightly backwards, because I learnt later that Feynman, you say, well, this was in Caltech, I was giving this lecture, and there was a poster of my talk coming up, and Feynman had seen this poster, and he told a colleague, and he says, I'm going to go and heckle this guy, you see. Okay, I start talking in the lecture, and I give it in Caltech, and Feynman is sitting there. And I get to a certain point, and somebody else sitting behind Feynman starts to heckle me. Feynman turns around and points at him and says, you shut up, listening to what the man's saying. So I was really proud of that one.
So 65 is your paper that essentially won the Nobel Prize in 2020, which is the singularity theorem, particularly for collapsing matter. So there are certain general circumstances where you will get a space-time singularity.
Yes, well, you see, this was at a time when the quasars were being discovered. It was very strange, these enormously energetic things and these waves coming in from these things which seemed to be very distant. The people were arguing, is that really, maybe it's a gravitational redshift, it's not, they're so distant. There were lots of arguments. And the real puzzle was, you see, there had been this paper, there still is this paper by Oppenheimer, the great physicist, Oppenheimer, and a student of his, Snyder, and they'd written this paper which discussed, which you might call a gravitational collapse. It was a dust cloud, and the dust cloud collapses, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and then becomes this singular state. But the trouble with this thing is first that it's dust. And dust is a very idealized material. It doesn't have any pressure and all that, so it's really not real matter at all. But the main thing is it's exactly spherically symmetrical. So as things fall in, where have they got to go? They've got to hit the central point. So the fact that everything hits the central point and the density becomes infinite at the central point is very artificial. And people say, well, we don't believe that. No, it won't meet a central point because swirling around and swishing out again. So that was the general picture people had. And so this was what my theorem showed was wrong. But it doesn't come swishing out again. That if the material gets to have passed a certain point, that it can't escape. And this was this black hole picture, which, I just invented this, I remember. Yes, it was. Well, all these things, there are little stories which one tells about this. One of them was I was talking to Ivor Robinson. This was when I had an appointment. I worked at Birkbeck College in London. And Ivor Robinson was a wonderful man. He had a wonderful way of talking, and the Americans loved him because he had such flow ideas, and the language was wonderful. He never wrote anything down. He was a good physicist, but he never wrote a paper. He had to have a colleague to do the writing down. It was all through talk, you see. And he was talking to me like this, like wonderful. I was listening to him wonderfully. And then we came to this road. We crossed the road, and when we crossed the road, he stopped talking. Then we got to the other side, and he got talking in like this, and finally he left. And I had this strange feeling of elation. And I think, why do I feel elated in this way? And I thought, I can't pay what it was. I must have had some thought. I thought, I had no idea what it was. So I thought about what happened for breakfast. No. What happened when I walked through the woods? No. What happened in the bus when I came down and trained and all those things? No, it wasn't that. What happened later on? No. And then it thought, no, it was an idea which happened to me as I crossed the road. This idea come to me. And it was the idea of a trapped surface. So you had to characterize in a non-symmetrical way when a collapse had reached a point of no return. And this was an idea which I subsequently called a trapped surface. When you get the surface, it can be very irregular. It doesn't have to be symmetrical at all. But when it reaches this level, you can tell you're in trouble. And then I developed this way of arguing how to develop these techniques for doing general things in general. I think it was the techniques that people hadn't worked on. You worked on exact solutions and all this, but these were techniques which looked at general solutions and the properties that these general solutions had to have. And you could apply these techniques in this particular case, and you could see that there was no escape. You would have to have the singular thing that goes wrong. Can't continue the collapse in a nice way so that it comes swishing out again, and that's it.
So, were you familiar with general relativity at the time? Had you been studying it, or did you begin to think about it in the 60s when you started to think about physics?
Well, that was, again, it was sort of a chance event. A lot of these things were chance. I keep thinking, how many things go back? And I said, people ask me, what do you attribute your success to? And I said, well, I don't know. It's really, the main point is to be lucky. And I said, well, it doesn't help much if you're not lucky. And I had to think, well, it was this thing which I happened to share in an office with Engelbert Schücking. That was luck, you see. And I learned a lot of things from Engelbert Schücking. I mean, he was a great font of knowledge. I mean, it's a tremendous thing for him. And there were these things which were basically luck. And so this was also a bit of luck, too. Dennis had told me that there was a talk being given by David Finkelstein in London. This was when I was in Cambridge. I had a fellowship at St. John's, and Dennis Sharma was in Cambridge as well. And he said he'd drive me down to London to hear this talk by David Finkelstein. And this was about the collapse of a spherical body and how you could get rid of what used to be called the Schwarzschild singularity. It's not a singularity, it's a place you could actually fall through. It's what we now call a horizon. So it's the horizon of what we call a black hole now. And this was a very special case, but I was stunned by it. I thought, this is amazing. You can actually get through this thing which people thought was a singularity. It's just a horizon. And you can get through. But then you still get the singularity in the middle. So it doesn't help you there. So I began to think after this, well, what about the middle one? Maybe you can't get rid of that one, even if it's irregular. And so I began worrying about that. And I thought, how do I treat this problem? I don't know anything about general relativity. How do I stand? So I thought, well, what do I know about? Well, I know about two-component spinors. I won't try and describe what they are, but I knew about them from Dirac's lectures. There's even a little bit of a funny story there. Yeah, I don't know. You see, they're all funny stories, because this was a story because Dirac apparently deviated from his normal course of lectures. And people said, Dirac would never do that. He'd fixed on what he was going to say every time, exactly what we'd say in every lecture in the course. He would never deviate from that. And apparently he did on this occasion. I'm not even quite sure whether that story is true or not, but I like to think it was true. Because he gave a week's lecture on two-component spinors. And you see, I'd said to Dennis, I've got to learn about these two-component spinors. What are they? So Dennis said, well, read this book. This completely unreadable book. So I tried to read the book. I can't remember who it was by now. Utterly unreadable, and I couldn't make head or tail of it. And so that wasn't any good. But then Dirac gave a week's lecture on two-component spinors. I thought, everything has become beautifully clear. But the funny story about that is, apparently this was a deviation from his normal course of lectures, which he would never do. And so the story here, and I'm not sure about this, is that Dennis, you see, at this time was Dirac's only graduate student. And so Dirac, although he didn't talk much, he did talk to his graduate student. And there was an occasion that Dennis would say, he would talk to Dennis about what his latest idea was. And Dennis would get lost at a certain point. He said, well, I've got to say something. At a certain point, he said, is that the only way of doing it? You see, he just said, he had no idea what Dirac was talking about. Was that the only way of doing it? And then he heard later, Dirac gave a little talk and said, at this point, Mr. Sharma came up with a brilliant idea. He said this was not the only way of doing it, and there was another way of solving this problem. So that was a wonderful story. But anyway, Dirac apparently, so Dennis was his only student, had said that if he talked about two-component spinors, at least one person in his class would be interested. And I like to think that was the reason he talked about two-component spinors, because I was in his class. You see, I have no idea if that's true or not, but that's my little fantasy.
So following that paper, so your 1965 paper,
yes,
then Stephen Hawking essentially reverses it, or shows that there's also a singularity in our past, according to general relativity.
That was a conversation, yes. You see, that was the first time I met Stephen. And he at that time he could walk, and it was the condition that he had didn't develop very far. So I didn't even know that there was anything wrong with him. But I think it was, who was the people who organized it? Well, Brandon Carter was there, but the person who organized the meeting was, he's gone out of my, South African physicist, well-known chap. Gone out of my head right now. But anyway, there was a meeting that I had with Stephen, and I would describe the details of the singularity theorem that I had. So I talked to Stephen, and these other people, and Stephen picked up the ideas very quickly and developed them to try to apply them to cosmology. In fact, a very idea which he immediately had using my particular theorem, but turning it around and using it in a different context, which I thought was pretty impressive. But that was how we sort of got in contact originally. And then his thesis, this is Stephen Hawking's thesis, was he was on four or five different sections. They were all on different topics. And the last topic was on these singularity ideas, which he had. And it was a pretty impressive thesis. I think there was on four different topics, and I remember saying that any two of them would be worth a PhD.
Right. And these singularities, so the let's call it the black hole singularity, the gravitational collapse singularity, and the singularity, let's call it the Big Bang singularity.
Well, that was what Stephen sort of turned my theorem around the other way, to apply it the other way in time. So instead of you have something collapsing inwards, as you have for a black hole, you think about the Big Bang, which is things coming out. And the question is, maybe it could have been from some previous collapse, which swirled round in some way and came shooting out again. So the argument was to show, no, that wouldn't work with ordinary physical stuff.
Yeah. But these are singularities of a very different character, aren't they, which has informed a lot of your work since. The special nature, apparently, of the Big Bang singularity.
Well, you see, my theorem wouldn't quite work in that case, because my theorem depended on it being asymptotically flat, you see, whereas these things were not like that. So you couldn't apply my particular theorem to the Big Bang. You'd have to generate a different theorem. So a big part of what Stephen's research work was when he was a graduate student was on generalizing my techniques to apply more generally, so that they didn't need to apply to this particular techniques which I used for my particular theorem. And then after a while we wrote a paper together, which was more encapsulated all the ideas that we'd had after that.
Well, you then became interested, certainly in Emperor's New Mind and other books, in the idea that, so the origin of the universe, it's a very special state, let's say a low entropy state, a highly ordered state, which I think, well, I wouldn't put words into your mouth, you think is one of the greatest puzzles in all of physics. Why?
Which I can't remember when I wrote The Emperor's New Mind. There was a bit of what was in that book. It was so long ago.
Do you still think that the low entropy state, the apparent orderliness of the origin of the universe, is one of the biggest problems in physics?
Well, that came about really later, you see. I can't remember the dates of these things. Early in the 21st century. I can't quite remember where it was. I was visiting Princeton for a few days, and there was a meeting in there's a university right across the river from New York. Well, what is it? Stevens Institute. That's right. And they used to have meetings in the autumn and in the spring, I think. And a lot of people came from New York State and from different parts of New York State and got together. And you had to drive there in cars from Princeton. I was in Princeton. I didn't have a car. But I happened to see there was a car over there. And I thought, I see Jim Peebles in the car. And I thought, oh, there's Jim. I'm going to see if there's a gap in his car, because I want to ask him a question. And I looked in the car. There was no room in the car. But I thought, anyway, I'll ask him a question. And the question I asked him was, why don't you cosmologists only think of this particularly very simple, special kind of singularity, whereas we mathematicians consider all these different complicated kinds of singularities, and there are all these different things, and you don't think of it, you don't even consider all these other cases. You just look at this one simple special case. And he looked at me, and I said, why don't you look at these other cases? And he said, he looked at me, because the universe is not like that. And I thought, my God, he's right, it's not. It's like this very special case, and not like these all other cases like that. And so that set me on this particular route. Why is it on that particular simple case? And that sort of set me thinking about this, which set me thinking still on this fundamental problem. Yeah. Why is the Big Bang, that very, very special, simple kind of singularity, not like the complicated gravitational collapse? You have a great mess of stuff, which is nothing like what you see at the Big Bang. So it's a huge problem, which people didn't seem to recognize as a huge problem. I have my own answer to that problem, which I didn't come to until much later.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about that, so essentially conformal cyclic cosmology. So the idea essentially that the universe, I suppose is eternal. Would that be, that's the picture, which is what Einstein, by the way, preferred, right?
Yes, I think, well, he kept changing his mind. That was the trouble, for good reasons. He usually had a good reason each time for the mind change. But you see, he also had this problem with the cosmological constant. You see, his equations had a little term in it, you see, which would be really nice to put that to zero. It's just this number. You can make it zero. It's called the cosmological constant. So he couldn't make up his mind whether it should be there or not, I think. And he put it there for a reason, because he liked to have a static universe, because he was rather keen on that idea. And that turned out not to work, because the universe is expanding. I can't remember the history of it, but he certainly got confused about whether it should be there or not. And I think it should be there. But he introduced, well, now the trouble is now, you see, it's now called the mysterious dark energy. And I thought, mysterious dark energy? It's just the cosmological constant. We've known about that ever since Einstein. But it's become the mysterious dark energy. Well, I can't help it. That's what people want to call it.
So do you think that, so maybe you could describe very, very briefly your model, which is the conformal cyclic cosmology?
Well, it's a resolution of that problem, yes. Well, there's another little story too. So we've all got these little stories, you see. I have to tell this story slightly backwards, because I learnt later that Feynman, you say, well, this was in Caltech, I was giving this lecture, and there was a poster of my talk coming up. And Feynman had seen this poster, and he told a colleague, and he says, I'm going to go and heckle this guy, you see. Okay, I start talking in the lecture, and I give it in Caltech, and Feynman is sitting there. And I get to a certain point, and somebody else sitting behind Feynman starts to heckle me. Feynman turns around and points at him and says, you shut up, listening to what the man's saying. So I was really proud of that one. No, Feynman was absolutely right. I was trying to explain it was this problem about the uniformity. And if the uniformity is in a very special way, it's in gravity. Everything else seems to be in a maximum entropy, random as it can get, except for gravity. Gravity is not. It's very, very special. And this was the point I was trying to make. And Feynman picked it up very quickly. I enjoyed Feynman. He was a interesting guy to talk to.
Yeah. So in terms of the resolution to these problems, so we mentioned string theory before, and everybody laughed at. But in terms of trying to look for a deeper theory, so let's say quantum gravity.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.